feedback, saying what they like, what they would like to change, what they would like to have. And in the last event, someone among the participants suggested that given the current situation in Europe and its neighborhood, it would be timely to discuss democracy and how it is impacted by conflict, by war. So kind of also analyzing a democracy, prosperous democracy in time of peace, and one that is how it is affected by conflict and how it slowly limits the citizen participation in such a situation. So this is how we came up with this panel, and we are so happy to have with us three professors from the Free University of Brussels, which I'm also a graduate from. I had also a master's degree from ULB, so I'm so happy to have you here. It was actually it was not intended to have only speakers from ULB, but in the end they were the ones to apply, so thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I am hopeful that we will have a very interesting conversation. We will maybe start with Luca Tomini, if you agree. I think it's a more general perspective to start in this way. So you have the floor for about 10-12 minutes. We will have a presentation on early signs of backsliding democracy, and then we will, after everyone will have their time to present, we will also have Q&A sessions, so you will always have a chance to ask your questions. Okay? So it's up to you if you want to use this one. Yeah.
So thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks a lot for the invitation. First of all, thank you for being here today. It's really appreciated. I mean, it's hard to talk about this powerful and emotional message we have seen, in the video, but I will try to do my best. So I like, first of all, to start by a little bit positioning myself, in the current debate. There is, current debate about the state of democracy and the challenges it faces. So I think, on the one hand, we might heard the comforting message from some people that democracy is a given. Democracy is forever. Democracy, we shouldn't care too much about democracy because, it's a matter of fact that we have, freedoms, freedom of expression, right of votes, and so on. Basically, democracy is the natural political regime. But unfortunately, as we have seen in the video, and as we can see right now in all over the world, but also in Europe, democracy, we see many countries experiencing what we call democratic backsliding, trends like that. So democracy is not here to stay by definition or because of some natural laws, and so we should care about it, which was a little bit the message on the video by our grandparents or grandparents in some cases. So on the other hand, we also hear apocalyptic narratives about democracy. The fact that democracy is bound to fail, democracy is doomed, because it's a flawed system and it's not adapted to the challenges of the contemporary world, climate change, migration, aging society, war, etc., and so on. Reality check. On the other hand, is that a lot of important studies show that democratic countries perform better than autocracy in a lot of these matters. So the thing is, my message is very simple. Actually, democracy is a very resilient political system, very resilient political regime, more resilience compared to a lot of authoritarian countries. On the other hand, this doesn't mean that democracy is a given. Democracy is actually fragile. So the thing is, it requires a constant care. It requires, in some cases, active defense. And so here I will talk about, once again, I understand that my speech resonates a little bit with the video and the same word, but I will talk about the care and the defense of democracy. First of all, I'd like to, maybe clarify 2 points before I go into the topic. The first point is that, the title of my presentation is Early Signs of Democratic Backsliding, but actually I won't talk about democratic backsliding. I will prefer to use another term, which is autocratization, for the sake of precision. So actually, what we are really talking about, we are talking about some processes that transform our democracy, our political regime, by reducing civil liberties, by increasing the power of the executive, by reducing political and social pluralism. And in a nutshell, I mean, this is about the introduction of more and more authoritarian elements in our society, in our political regime, in our democracy. Until the eventual, not in all cases, not every time, the eventual transformation from democracy to autocracy. So we are talking about that, The second thing is, I prefer autocratization instead of democratic backsliding, because actually we are not really sliding back. Political regimes are not sliding back, moving back to some previous states, to some previous situation. Take for example Russia. Russia and Putin. Russia is not moving back to communist rule. Putin created a new form of authoritarian countries. A new form of authoritarianism. So actually, it's not really about sliding back, moving back to something that was before. It's actually about building something new, which is authoritarian, which is non-democratic. And the third thing is that, I mean, democracy, what we have seen, autocratization, not happen also in democratic countries. It also happens, around the world in less than perfect democracy. I mean, there's not perfect democracy out there, but it happens in hybrid regime. It even happens in countries that are already authoritarian and become even more authoritarian. Okay? So, and we can learn a lot of things by looking outside our, country, our continent, our European Union. If we look outside, we can see many similar processes, and we can learn a lot about these things also for our democratic system. So that's the maybe a short introduction or a methodological introduction for my speech. The second point is, just to understand what we are talking about, I will give you some data, some elements to understand the scope of the phenomenon of autocratization. So I'm using the most recent data by the Videm Institute, which is a research institute based in Sweden. Actually, the world today is almost evenly divided between 91 democracies and 88 autocracies. So take it, like that at the moment. But two-thirds of the world population actually lives in different form of autocratic system. Okay, and only 1/3 of world population lives in different forms of democracy. Okay, 1/3, 2/3. This is an increase of 45 more compared to 10 years ago, and there's a reason why. I will tell about that later. Among the different regimes out there, electoral autocracy have by far the most people, 44 of the world population. Electoral autocracy are, this kind of regime, not like North Korea, where you don't even have election, are some authoritarian system where you have some form of electoral politics, flow election, not free nor fair, but still, so we call them electoral autocracy. And so, on the other hand, I said, just 1/3 of the world population lives in democratic system. And what about the trend of transformation? What about the change from one type of regime to the other? Actually, 60 countries right now are in episode of transformation from, democracy to autocracy, or from autocracy to democracy, democratization or autocratization. So countries are constantly moving back and forth. And autocratization, and that's the bad news, is ongoing in 42 countries all over the world, compared to only 18 countries democratizing, And if we consider the size of this country, for example, one of the most influential and most relevant and important countries autocratizing right now is India. And that's also explained, the size, the number of people, the population. But there are also good news, Brazil, Poland are countries that right now are in processes of democratization after experienced democratic backsliding or autocratization in the past. So, the question is, what we can do about that, if we can do something. And so, I will talk about the cure, and I will talk about the defects. So, the cure, we should, as I said, we should take care of democracy, but the thing is that we should also be able to recognize the threat to democracy. So, what are the signs that there is a possible autocratization process, and what we can do about. So I'm quoting Javier Corrales, who is a very renowned Latin American scholar who work on political regimes in Latin America, and he explained that we should look at 3 I, basically, what he called pre-existing stresses. The first I is inequality. So inequality is, can be defined in a very different way, but in a nutshell, pronounced form of skew wealth distribution or ethno-linguistic inequality in society that on the one hand produce, anger, strong anti-elite, strong anti-status quo, anti-establishment sentiment, and on the other hand, on the elite side, on the ruling, elite side, it produces excessive conservatism. So inequality is one of the most powerful, indication that there is something going on in our society, a risk, that we face. The second I is insecurity. So once again, a perceived in-group that begins to feel threatened, by some other groups or by some types of events, Insecurity is, to some extent, a matter of perception. So we can have a perceived threat which is real, sometimes, can be like some kind of socio-economic decline of a specific group in society, but it can also be a perceived, a constructive threat, also inflated by ruling elite, by political party, by leader that use this perceived, sentiment for their reason, for the strategies to get consensus from people. So insecurity. The third I is incapacity. The inability of the existing political system to deal with the issue, to deal with the challenges of society, because of many different reasons. That might be due to legislative gridlock, bureaucratic incompetence, systematic corruption in society, in the government, and so on. So many factors that makes government incapable, the political regime incapable to deal with the threat, with the challenges. So inequality, insecurity, incapacity, and I will add a fourth element that Corrales didn't talk about that, but this is now something which is really clearly emerging in a lot of countries, which is polarization. Polarization. And I will say extreme, or there's always a degree of polarization in our society, but we talk about extreme or toxic level of polarization. Basically, the division of society into 2 different camps, distrustful, antagonistic camp, where there is diminishing respect for the opponents, diminishing respect not for causal reasoning, factual reasoning, engagement with other idea, belief, increasing use of hate speech by political leader, radicalization in two opposing factions. We know what we are talking about. There's a lot of examples in our society actually. So these 3 factors are fundamental and structural preambles of autocratization. They do not produce autocratization per se. They do create the favorable condition for, And the favorable condition can be exploited by, power-hungry elite, illiberal leaders, illiberal political parties, in our countries to then, tear down the institution of democracy. So if we care about democracy, we should take care about these 4 areas, reducing inequality in society, working to create safe society for everyone, mitigate the sense of real or perceived insecurity, improving democratic institutions to create more stable, more effective, transparent, representative institution, and depolarize the public debate, especially starting with the media, with the traditional media, the new media, etc. But the thing is that, no democracy, and this is a vast program, So, and especially no democracy is perfect, no political system is perfect. Something can always happen, even if we try to cure our democracy, so something can happen. And in this case, what we can do, and when we have a leader, when we have an authoritarian, wannabe authoritarian leader in power, or a politically liberal political party in power that shows some signs of authoritarianism. So, and especially what are these signs, and I refer to there's a lot of works out there, but I refer specifically to political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, they identify 4 red flags, of leaders and parties. The first one is the rejection or weak commitment to democratic rule of the system. People that say, for example, I wanna quote a specific person, but that can say, if I lose, I won't respect the electoral results. Or the second is the denial of the legitimacy of political opponents. The fact that this is my enemy. This is not my political opponent. This is the enemy of society. The third one is the toleration of encouragement of violence. Okay. So if we accept violent acts, as a political tool in democracy, that's a red flag. And the fourth one is the readiness to curtail civil liberties of the opponents, including the media. We are ready to, if we win, we are ready to, for example, shut the media or the opposition, or reduce the space for the opposition. So it's useful to recognize, some possible threat in advance. But when this leader take power, usually through election, usually through free and fair election in democracy. This happened in the past, this is happening, I don't need to quote someone, and then they start to expand executive power, to control the judiciary, to manipulate the electoral laws, to control the media, to reduce civil liberties. So in short, when a process of autocratization is already ongoing, what do we do? And here, I think, comes the concept of resistance, against autocratization, that probably my colleague Susan Gibril will speak about later. And resistance can come from different actors, from institutional actors, from judges, from official, from state official. Resistance comes from political opposition, from faction within the ruling party, from coalition division. Resistance comes especially from society, from civil society organization, unions, association, ordinary citizens mobilizing, for democracy. Socioeconomic and cultural actors, or in some cases, even from external actors, can come from outside. The bad news is that, we do not have a receipt, we do not have a playbook, we do not have, a lesson, that there's no resistance playbook out there, for easy adoption, in any cases, for any situation. Resistance strategies might differ for the context, it's a complex matter too. It depends on the available means of the actors, but we are learning, I would say, a lot from the field, from practitioner, by looking what happened in the field and by, academic studies and so on. So I just, I don't want to talk about lesson because there's no lesson here, but maybe some small pieces of evidence, that come from these, academic studies or field experience of fighting autocratization, when autocratization is ongoing. So the first is that there is no silver bullet. Basically, there is no, one size fits all solution. Democratic resilience depends on the identification of the most effective constellation of actors and strategies in any given countries. But in most cases, the thing is that, that's very, maybe obvious, but unity makes strength. And sometimes it's not so evident. Sometimes it's not so easy for opposition, for different sector of the opposition, to create a unitary resistance against, an incumbent authoritarian wannabe autocrat in power. But there are also some good examples. We have seen this in Poland, for example, last year. Where a kind of, authoritarian government were replaced through election. And a combination of actors from society, work together. The second piece of evidence is that context matters. We need to be able to identify the threat. Where the threat is coming from. It's coming from a populist authoritarian leader, a populist authoritarian party. Is it coming from, an economic conglomerate fostering state capture, corruption in state institution? Is it coming from, a direct military threat from outside or even from within? There's a lot of, unfortunately, around the world, there's a lot of examples of military coup d'etat, in many countries. So identifying the threat is the first step in addressing it. The third point is that strategies of resisting autocratization must be built at different levels. Okay, not only at national level, but also subnational level in some situation, also at global level in some other situation, transnational level in some other situation. And this is basically linked to my first point that unity makes strength. But unity across all levels makes strength. And the fourth point is that especially when we talk about autocratization in democratic states, in democratic regime, experience show that violence means should be avoided. Reality is that violence used to counter authoritarian leaders in democracy usually backfire against those resisting autocratization, because it delegitimizes the people that use violence. And usually this bad choice of tools ends up with an acceleration of the autocratization in the countries. So, in conclusion, and I think I will stop there because I'm already, out of time. So democracy, as I said at the beginning, is not the most fragile political regime, but it's not a given either, So it's something in between. It requires constant, care, constant defense, as we have seen from the witness, in the video. It's especially up to us, I think, after the grandparents, it's up to us as individual, as a society to ensure the survival of democracy. Okay? So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I have a lot of questions now, but let's maybe wait a bit on this. And let's go on to our second presentation, which I think is very timely because you talked about autocratization instead of the backsliding democracy. I think that was the word that you preferred instead. So we will now go on with our second speaker, Suzanne Gibril, and she's also a professor at Will Be and a postdoctoral fellow at civic. And she will be presenting exploring the constraints on citizen participation in autocratic regimes, and we will have also a case study analysis. We will have a visual presentation, so let's check if it's working. It should be able to, yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to actually kind of piggyback on what Luca was saying. And give you maybe more of a practical insight into resistance and counter-resistance strategies. So resistance by actors and counter-resistance strategies by power incumbents within mainly authoritarian regimes, and giving you snippets of practical fieldwork that I conducted in Egypt and Tunisia over the past seven years or so. And I'll start with this first visual, which will actually give more insight into what Luca was saying, is this having 70% of the world population living in autocratic or autocratizing regimes. And obviously the most important thing to keep in mind when we discuss authoritarian regimes and autocratizing regimes is that they have different levels of autocratization. So you have democracies sliding into autocracies or adopting autocratizing strategies, but then you have obviously the more authoritarian and harder versions of authoritarianism that develop over the globe. So I'll be mainly focusing on these more authoritarian contexts. First, what are these repressive measures? Different measures are being put in place by these authoritarian regimes at different degrees, again. One of them being one of the most common ones is censorship, which is the act of suppressing or prohibiting the expression of ideas of information or perspectives by different actors, and they can do it through media control or through internet surveillance or internet restrictions. And comes hand in hand with that is the surveillance and monitoring in general. It can be surveillance via social media, it can be surveillance, physical surveillance and physical intimidation. And that is mainly done through different activities, whether it's citizens' activities, whether it's through the monitoring of communications between different activists, or by monitoring and tapping different movements, whether they're social movements, political movement, etc. Maybe something that's important to mention is that here I'm focusing on the civil society actors, not the political and institutional actors. So it's really bottom-up perspectives here. Regarding other tactics, you have arrest and detention, which is quite classic, especially in more closed forms of authoritarian regime, with the arrest and detention of different individuals without real legal justification and without a legal due process. So basically just arresting people based on the fact that they represent a threat to national security, for example. And it's obviously targeting dissidents, political activists, any critic of the regime, and any opposing members, whether it's members of the opposition in political arenas, but also political opponents within civil society. Then you have the more classic restriction of civil liberties, which can happen at different times in different contexts. And within these more repressive or more closed forms of authoritarianism, these restriction of civil liberties go through different paths and different channels, including the curtailing of fundamental rights and freedoms, the freedom of speech, freedom of congregation, freedom of assembly, or the freedom of press. And then finally, and it's a tactic that is most used in authoritarian regimes, is the use of violence and force, whether it's military intervention or police brutality. It's also something that, unfortunately, we have seen more and more in democratic regimes, with the opposition of massive demonstrations. I'm thinking of France, or even more recently, ongoing in the United States. So the use of police brutality to suppress protests, to suppress demonstrations, and to limit civil disobedience. So these are different tactics that are being used at different degrees. Some are used in unison, so they use all of these tactics in some regimes, some don't. And here is a more practical visualization of these events. The two bottom images have been taken in Egypt and Tunisia respectively. The top is a picture taken in Taiwan in 2019, if I'm correct. And it just shows the different varieties of intimidation and control that can happen within a society. So you have the more repressive, brutal use of force in the top image, but then you have the very visual pictures of people considered to be a national security threat. This is the middle image taken. These are Muslim brothers that have been arrested in Egypt. And then the bottom image with a very theatrical arrest. And the third, the image here on the right is just this concept of surveillance, whether it's physical or digital. Digital surveillance is easy to track through the social media, but then you also have a very important portion of the civil surveillance, which is quite present in authoritarian regimes, and specifically quite present in Egypt, where you have a very strong monitoring of citizens among each other. So quite difficult to express political opinions or opinions that would have a political nature. So in this context, is resistance futile? When you have very closed forms of authoritarian regime, when you have highly repressive measures that are put in place, what happens to resistance? Now, as I said, I'll be focusing here on civil resistance, specifically because institutional and or political actors have very little wiggle room in such contexts. So we have to turn to the biggest force, which is civil society as a whole. And there are different tactics that are put in place within these strategies. I'll be looking at alternative strategies of resistance. Of course, the most common one is the nonviolent civil disobedience, which is basically demonstrations, sit-ins, petitions, boycotts by civil society members, by social movements, by political actors that gather and that oppose and challenge laws and policies without resorting to violence. And this is what we've observed during the Arab uprisings, the Iranian revolution of 2022, the ongoing civil rights movements in all parts of the globe. So this civil disobedience, which has a non-violent nature. And then you have other types of alternative resistance strategies, most notably digital activism and hacktivism, which are quite related. Digital activism is the use of social media platforms to spread awareness, to organize protest, amplify these voices, these dissenting voices within a given context. And then you have hacktivism, and that's using the hacking techniques to disrupt and expose the different policies by authoritarian regimes in their censorship efforts or in their controlling efforts. So these usually work hand in hand. The most common or the most well-known group in this hacktivism is Anonymous, for example. And then you have a last type of resistance strategy, which is artistic resistance. And this is what I focus on in my research specifically. So what does artistic resistance mean? It basically means that you use different tools to resist and express your opinion, but using alternative methods, such as music, such as street art, graffiti. It can be poetry, slam, it can be the use of literature, civil disobedience and strikes, or other methods, sport, it can be theater, dance, any type of artistic or cultural tool that can be used to avoid state repression practically and change the messages of resistance that can be voiced and be able to challenge this control and inspire change within a given society. What does it look like practically? There are different ways of expressing it. Now you have the more visual and theatrical ones, such as the bottom in the middle. This is a picture taken during the Iranian Revolution of 2022, where women would cut their hair on the streets in a very theatrical manner. So this is half theater, half civil disobedience. And then you have other ways. You have the use of music. The top left picture is taken during the Egyptian uprisings of 2011. It's one of the voices of the revolution, and song and music, lyrics was something that was actually quite widespread in opposing authoritarian methods. You have the use of street art and graffiti, frescoes that pop up everywhere on the walls that can be pictured and archived, and that's important. I'll get back to that in a second. But all of these are powerful images that remain within history afterwards. And then you have the use of the sporting arena, the top right corner. This is quite common to use the sporting arena, whether it's the football stadium or Olympic Games arenas, to express opinions that may not be usually expressed in civil society. In this case, this is also a picture that was taken in an Egyptian stadium during the 2011-2012 period that was contesting the security forces, the armed security forces of Mubarak. And then the bottom right picture was a picture taken in Lebanon, and this is the pentacle of civil disobedience. It's basically the idea that when you have, and this was the case also in Iran during the 79 revolution, is when you are confronted with a regime that refuses to listen and that represses you completely, there are other ways of opposing, and it can simply be refusing to take out your garbage, but it can also be refusing to turn off your lights at a certain time, or filling in administrative forms wrong. And those are, in the worst case scenario, very efficient ways of exposing regime inconsistency. Now, as researchers, I'm a researcher conducting fieldwork, extended fieldwork in these contexts. How do I practically observe resistance, especially in contexts that are more and more closed and that put more and more the respondents, but also researchers, in danger? Well, and I think that this is a message of hope. In the most closed, even the most closed contexts, resistance never dies. It always adapts and it reorganizes. So sometimes one can think that resistance has disappeared, but it's sometimes dormant, sometimes it's on hiatus, and sometimes it can be observed in the most common places. And there are different tactics here. You can observe by acting. What does that mean? That basically means that when you're conducting research and fieldwork, I always recommend, whether it's students or PhD students or whoever wants to observe resistance or everyday resistance, is just to walk around neighborhoods and get a sense of the context. And that really helps in grasping these non-verbal interactions, whether it's looks or whether it's the way that people dress, the way that people sit, the way that people converse, whether they're very open and communicative, or whether they tend to whisper or hide away. Those are very efficient ways. You also have online fieldwork, that is, so online ethnography of social media, for example, monitoring, where you follow different resistance actors online and monitor them there. And then the very important place of archives and memory, so oral history. How is history being shared within communities? What events are being highlighted? What events are being put to the forefront when you're actually talking about history or talking about events? I didn't speak of this in the different measures, but the most repressive regimes will try and change history through education, mainly. So they will change the course of events in history books. So teach the kids that what their parents or their sisters or their friends went through was not, in fact, the reality. And oral history helps in that sense. And the archive, so archiving pictures or archiving videos of different concerts is a very efficient way as well. And also working with loopholes. So that is something that is quite used in authoritarian regimes. What does that mean? It means that there are always certain topics that are accepted as a given. For example, in the Tunisian case, there's a huge campaign against feminicides. And these events or these demonstrations are widely used as a pretext to gather and to discuss about other topics. So obviously you're there to oppose feminicides, but you're also there to discuss and share ideas. So they're quite efficient loopholes, and all of this helps in planting the future seeds of dissent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. Maybe while we have our first speaker back, we can have time to take a question if any of the reflection that we heard. Is it okay? We can.
Sorry.
No worries, no worries. So we will then continue with our first presentation, and then we will have the questions. I'm afraid to say your family name wrongly, to pronounce it wrongly,
No, no,
so I won't.
you won't be
I will
referred
just
to the
present
last, so
Professor Martin, who is also professor at ULB and associate researcher at Crespo. I'll give him the floor for his presentation titled Reassessing European Citizenship Amidst Evolving Geopolitical Realities in Europe.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry because by training, I'm a historian of political ideas. So what I've got to say is slightly more speculative, but because it's speculative and a little bit abstract, what I suggest is that I present it as a story. And because it's a meandering story, I'm going to give you the conclusion. I'm going to tell you where it's going to end so that you don't get lost on the way. And I got 2 points I'd like to make here. The first one is I'd like to defend the idea that European democracy is tied to a different notion that I'm going to explain in a minute, which is constitutional patriotism. I'd like to unpack this notion and explain a bit what it is. I'd like to say that this notion, in the current context, where Europe is under threat from a form of, is under several geopolitical threats, that notion needs to be updated. I think it is slightly outdated now, and we need to rethink this, and that's my second point. We'll see how I get to that. I'd like to start by telling you a little story. My story starts in 1932 actually, when a legal philosopher, a young and upcoming legal scholar in Germany, writes a book which is called The Concept of the Political. The goal of that book appears to be very abstract, but actually has direct political consequences. Because the goal of that book is to try and define what it is exactly that we do when we do politics. What is politics exactly? How can we say that something is political while another thing is not? And the answer that this young scholar gives is to say, well, something is political when there is a conflict that is so intense that the horizon of that conflict is death. So if I'm engaged in a collective conflict whose horizon is death, then I'm talking about politics. Which means that politics is about being able to make a distinction between who are my friends and who are my enemies. When I need to distinguish between those two things, I'm doing politics. That young and upcoming legal scholar is Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt is going to put his money where his mouth is, because the next year he's going to buy his membership card to the Nazi regime, and he's going to remain unapologetic about it. He says, in the context of the 30s in Germany, what we need to do is to define who the enemies are and who the friends are. And we need to make that distinction. This is what politics is about. In a way, one could argue that the supranational political integration process that was started after the Second World War, on the ashes of the Second World War, is a way to respond to the challenge that was put forward by Carl Schmitt, is to say, well, no, we think actually it's possible to make politics, but in a way that would not confront us with having to make a choice between friends and enemies. We don't need to build politics on an existential conflict. We actually think it's possible to build a political community where we are able to look past and go beyond our national differences, where we are able to reconcile ourselves with our former enemies. And that, in a way, is what we are trying to achieve with the European Union. And interestingly, I mean, the European Union, on the face of it, has been a tremendous success in that respect. It is a peace project that has delivered. It's been able to enforce peace over the whole continent for now about 60, 70 years. So in that respect, it's been extremely influential. Why was that influential? And there we find an answer from another German philosophers. German philosophers have played an important part in the integration process. And that second German philosopher is Jürgen Habermas. And Jürgen Habermas says, well, the way we were able to look past those differences and to overcome that sort of political challenge that's thrown at us by Carl Schmitt is because we were able to rely on what he called constitutional patriotism. What does that mean? That means that our commitment to our political community is not founded, it does not rely on our hatred of another. It doesn't have to be anchored in a conflict. We can very well feel attached to a political community because we feel that this political community is respectful of what we identify as some core tenets of that make it possible for us to live together. Those core tenets, what are they? Well, it's very simple. It's human rights, it is democracy, and it's the rule of law, in a nutshell. So, constitutional patriotism means that we're not attached to a political community because it's our nation, or because it's part of a shared identity, or because we feel that, we feel strongly about it, or no, we are attached to it because first and foremost, it is a community that delivers on those different principles, that protects democracy, that protects the rule of law, that protects human rights. But even that definition was challenged in Germany again in the 80s. In the 80s, you have an historian called Ernst Nolte, who starts saying, well, we have a problem with our German history. We do not know how to write our history books. Because when we are writing our history books, well, at one point we have to account for the Nazi era. We have to discuss the Holocaust. And when we do that, if we are being candid and upfront about what happened, we are painting an image of our nation with which the youth cannot identify. They do not want to take up this guilt, this collective guilt, that makes them feel bad about it. And therefore, they cannot feel German. They cannot identify with it. And so, we need to tone it down a bit when we discuss about Nazism. We need to water down the version of history that we write about Germany. And Jürgen Habermas is going to step into that conversation because he's horrified by this prospect. He says, well, no, this is absolutely not what we should do. What we should do, because if we do that, eventually we're going to tone it down, then we're going to forget about it, and then our core principles, those core principles of democracy, human rights, and rule of law, they are going to go down the drain. And history is going to repeat itself. So we do not want to do that. What we want to do, if we are to preserve constitutional patriotism, is to acknowledge that this comes with a certain way to relate to our history. What is that way? It's not to take up guilt, because guilt doesn't help anyone. It's by being responsible, not guilty, about our historical past. So we should not forget that past. We should not let it go down the drain. We should remember it. And we should remember it and have a form of constant critical feedback on our past. And interestingly, this is, in a way, how Europe was able to build itself as a political project. Not by forgetting on what it was built, not by forgetting the Second World War, not by forgetting the Holocaust, but rather by having a constant critical loop that allows us to remind ourselves of what happened. Which means that, in a way, if Europe was built on an opposition to another, that other was the past of Europe. It was the mass murders that were committed in the name of Europe that is the other of the European Union, in a way. So we have, if you wish, a form of conflict within Europe, but it's an historical conflict with ourselves, with our past. Now, why do I think this? And I think that we should never, I think this is a proper way to represent it, and this is what was somehow echoed, I think, in the movie we saw earlier. It was basically the elders saying, don't forget about our generation, don't forget about what happened. But where I think that the movie was very interesting also is that it was somehow also anticipating the point I want to make, is that memory that we are refreshing constantly, that helps us not to fall back on the sort of mistakes made by people like Carl Schmitt, that story needs to be diverse. Because, as I mentioned, constitutional patriotism is born in a very German context. And it's nourished, which is normal, by the German history. But so what is at the very center of this is the memory of the Holocaust, which of course should be central, which of course should never be forgotten. But while Europe got more and more diverse, I think it is important that this is not the only mass crime committed by Europeans in the past, and that if we are to sustain constitutional patriotism through this effort of sustaining and critical feedback with our history, we need to acknowledge that this history is diverse and that there is not only the Holocaust. We've seen that in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, there is the memory of the Soviet regimes. We need to remember also that for many of the member states, there is a longer history of colonial enterprises. And I think when we are designing, specifically when we are designing the European migration policies, we should bear this in mind. And that at the moment, Europe is at risk of forgetting and losing contact with its core tenets, because it does not integrate that colonial memory when it designs its own migration policies. And therefore, it is building a relationship with its neighboring countries that looks more and more like what Schmitt was designing, what was mentioning, an opposition between Europe, defined not as a space in which we have those key tenets, democracy, rule of law, and human rights, but as a civilization that needs to be protected, that is opposed to outside threats. If we allow this to happen, I'm afraid that we might fall into the sort of Schmitt's pitfall again. And I think it would be very important and somehow urgent that we remember on which what is the other of Europe, and that the other of Europe it's its own past, and that its past is diverse. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for the few presentations. I personally enjoyed it a lot. I think we have a few minutes to gather some questions. Alex, would you help me please with the microphone, the mobile microphone or coming up? Thank you so much. Thank you.
So, thank you. We are currently facing all over the world, including in Europe, the rise of authoritarianism and its associated violence, and like assassination of opponents, speedy trials, arbitrary detention, media control, internet shutdown. And while it's easy to point fingers at certain regimes like China, Russia, Egypt, given the obvious violation there, I think it takes more clarity and humility to realize and admit that violations are now happening at the very heart of our democracies. We often feel that all of this happens elsewhere, at worst in Central or Eastern Europe, but never in our Western countries. So when a number of red lines are crossed, we still perceive ourselves as democracies in good health. Don't you think that increasing socio-economic inequalities and the concentration of wealth in the hand of an elite are indeed red lines, favorizing the erosion of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism, even in our Western countries? It may seem essentialist, but in my opinion, this is the source of most of the threats we discussed, like the increasing concentration of wealth undermines the foundation of democracies in several ways. It weakens middle class. It often translates in reduce political participation as individuals are more concerned about their immediate needs than public affairs. Also, it creates imbalance in the democratic process, like where the interest of the ultra-rich can prevail over the common goods, and it results in policies such as tax cuts for the wealthiest, deregulation favorable to multinational corporation, austerity policies, and that disproportionately affect the most vulnerable. And so, also regarding political campaign, like how they are funded, like corruption, or as we recently seen with it, or European institution, for instance, the Qatar Gate. So to counter this, I think it's crucial to implement policies like tax reform to redistribute the wealth, measures to strengthen the transparency and integrity of the political process, as well as initiatives to promote economic and social inclusion. So if the European Union is a tremendous success, as you said, in promoting peace, one of the major criticisms it often faces is prioritizing the market economy over its citizen. So do you think the return of austerity policies jeopardize this peace? Thank you.
To whom is the question addressed? For everyone? Okay. Who wants to take this?
There is one. Yeah.
There are two aspects, I think, to your questions. The first one is inequalities, and the second one is the transfer of inequalities into the political sphere. And I think it's important to target both. I would say, yeah, absolutely, regarding inequalities. This is what was mentioned earlier. It is one of the early signs of a slide towards autocratization. So I think it is important to pay attention to that, and we need to restore a form of justice in that respect. But I think it is what often, because that's the easy and quick answer, but what often gets forgotten is the extent to which we've allowed economic inequalities to trickle into the political sphere. We used to have some guardrails that would prevent the economically most advantaged to transfer that form of advantage into the political realm. And now we have dismantled many of those protections. And I think this is another problem, is that we really need to build some guardrails. For instance, we should make very sure that we pay more attention to the way the medias are being bought and structured. Because if you have certain very rich people that are able to buy certain set of press and medias, and therefore to bias the public conversation, then we run into major issues. And I think this is something we haven't paid enough attention to. So we need tax reforms on one hand, I fully agree, but we also need to put in place some checks on the way those economic inequalities trickle down into the political world.
Would you have any other remarks to add, the other speakers? Would you like to add something on the question?
Well, actually, it's a very rich discussion to have, and I completely agree with both of you, actually. And I think that the issue today is that authoritarian regimes have become more authoritarian, and democratic regimes have, I wouldn't say adopted authoritarian methods, I wouldn't go that far, but the cursor has been moved, whether it's by changing political strategies, whether it's changing of political priorities, the increased polarization within societies, as well as different crises. The COVID crisis was a perfect example of this shifting of the cursor towards more control over the population. In authoritarian regimes, it was used to control the population better and curtail civil liberties, but in democracies, this question can be posed. Why have certain measures restricting civil liberties within European and Western democracies not been suspended once the pandemic was over. So it's a whole question that would necessitate more discussion, but it's a very interesting topic, and I think it's quite reflective of the crisis and the ongoing debate that is happening today, whether it's here before the elections, the European elections, but it's also ongoing within society as a whole, whether it's political issues or societal issues as well.
Would you like to know? No. Okay, so we have another question. Yes, please.
Thank you. I don't know if that's on. Test. Oh, okay. Hello, I'm Cecilia. I'm from Young European Movement. There's Mena, she's with me as well. Firstly, I thought it was a fantastic panel, really balanced, really liked the kind of philosophical, the pragmatic, and the speculative. So I thought that was just brilliant and really interesting about what you said about things not being on like a linear scale and being able to actually differentiate out the fact that there's kind of constant transformative processes and that things are in a kind of process of transition. I thought that was spot on. I found it really interesting, Suzanne, what you said about like kind of the different ways that democracy can be attacked, particularly in the restriction of civil liberties. And as you might be aware, in 2022 in the UK, they passed the Police Crime and Sentencing Act, right, which obviously creates very, very dangerously vague language and all of these loopholes that the police can stop the right to assembly and essentially the right to protest, which is really quite scary. But what I wanted to focus on was the kind of zeroing in on media, so freedom of the press, because I was reading a study literally, I think today actually, on how particularly women, female journalists and reporters are being attacked. And it's now 75% have experienced attacks online, 25% sexual harassment as part of their jobs. And we're seeing arrests in everywhere, obviously Iran, Turkey, Turkmenistan, all sorts of countries, and some that you would think are quite democratically developed. So I suppose I kind of wanted to zero in on the digital activism and where you see digital democratic development and resilience coming from, and how do we tackle things? Because something we were talking about literally today was all the deep fakes and the misinformation that gets spread. And there was literally a video that I believed that was Biden, and I'm pretty political and I thought I knew my stuff, but clearly not. So I think that for me is kind of terrifying, because obviously the average voter is not going to be, questioning every single video that they watch. So how do we develop digital resilience, basically, in a nutshell?
Thank you.
Give me a few minutes. Sure. Okay. It is really interesting to discuss that, because AI today is something that is being used both by resistance actors, but also by, and more by regime incumbents. And that's a really interesting aspect. It's something that's very new in research, because obviously research is always late on the news. So it's something that is being developed now, that I'm really interested in, and that I'm going to try and develop as much as I can. But the main aspect of resistance here, and especially digital resistance and digital surveillance, is it comes from the action and reaction. It's like you have to think of these of these relations, power relations and power dynamics, as a dynamic relation. So you have a law that's passed by regime incumbents, for example, and then these laws they trickle down to society, and society reacts using their means of resistance. When those don't work, they go digital, and when those don't work, they go abroad, like they internationalize themselves. And the most powerful thing, I think, about these resistance strategies, especially today, is the use of digital activism. And the use of social media, the use of these platforms, whether it's Instagram or even TikTok, is that they create communities. So you have obviously the more negative aspect of it, where you have the use of deepfakes, you have the use of AI, you have the use of digital control, and so the suppression of certain accounts or even the arrest of certain activists. But you also have, on the other hand, this kind of, it's like a forest fire, right? When you post something on Instagram or on social media in general, it spreads like wildfire, and you have these communities that are being created and that are adapting constantly to these measures. So the question of AI today is something that is quite delicate, especially regarding the misinformation or the transformation of realities as we perceive them. But the same thing happened at the beginning of social media, where you had this news that's been spreading quite quickly, quite rapidly. So you have these fact-checking, and I think the next panel will be discussing this a little bit more. So fact-checking and just going back to the sources, and yeah, it's just about keeping up with the technology that is advancing so quickly. But I'd say that the strength of this form of activism is the strength of the networks that are being developed so quickly.
Would you like to add something to that, the speakers? No? I hope you have a bit more answers for our second panels, which we will be discussing precisely that. Yeah, please.
I have actually, okay. Yeah, I have actually two questions, one for Luca and one for Martin. The first one, is it, no? Okay, sorry. The first one for Luca, because you were saying that you think it's, conceptually speaking, better to speak about autocratization rather than democratic backsliding. I was curious to know if you're doing it because maybe it's better to use autocratization because it's a way, it's a concept that it's easier to operationalize when doing research. Because I find in some contexts still talking about backsliding, so feeling that we're going back to something that we had, for example, even for Russia in a sense, not backsliding to USSR, but the Tsarist ideas are still in Putin's behavior, but also in Europe. Once you have a good tradition of democratic processes that is ongoing, that has been ongoing for a lot, it still maybe makes sense to say, okay, we're backsliding a bit back to the past, instead of saying autocratization, in the sense that there's a continuum, so we're going to from 0 to 1, and we can operationalize it better when we're studying the processes. And then I have to the other one on I shall wait. Okay. The second one is for Martin, because you spoke a lot about how we are about our historical identity with regards to the concept of Europe and European Union, and I'm always baffled about the fact that we're always positing our European identity in negative terms. We're always speaking about the Second World War II, this is what happened, this is what we are not, we don't want to be. But to me, Europe is a lot more than the Second World War. For example, Europe to me is the place where in the during the Renaissance, science and been operationalized and became something in general, a methodology where we thought about religious conflicts. There's a lot, historically speaking, about Europe. There's a lot of political traditions in the UK, Locke, liberalism, there's the French kind of political tradition. So why we are always at least nowadays, in the past few decades, we're always positing Europe as a negative concept. For example, there's this good, pretty great piece of work, for me, for example, of Urbinati, this is a political philosopher, Nadia Urbinati, about democratic individualism. For example, in the US, they are not positing their identity in negative terms. They are posing their identity in positive terms, like this is what we are, like, this is our tradition. Still in Europe, I feel like we're kind of like concerting ourselves to say, okay, this is what we are not this is what we are, like, because we are good because of that. So what do you think? Like, do you think it's a problem? Do you feel like the problem? Are you getting what I'm like trying to argue for? Thanks.
Would you like to start?
Yeah, very quickly. Thanks a lot for the question. I mean, my question is, just use the concept you want. I mean, I don't really want to, I mean, I don't think it's really useful to go into this kind of maybe boring, academic discussion about the concept. But the thing is that there's, apart from the reason I gave you at the beginning, I think, there's two reasons why autocratization should be preferred, because, there's not only something which is removed when we observe this kind of process, There's also something that is built, We are not only removing democratic feature, we are actively, autocratic leaders, they are actively building autocratic feature. And the thing is that, for people who really knows autocratic regimes, Susan, for example, that, there's a variety of authoritarianism. So I think that putting, the focus only, not only on the thing that we remove, but also the thing that we built, the autocratic feature we built is an important thing. And the second is that, we might like it, but in reality, democracy is not the natural state of things. It's not the natural state of, and it's not even, the ending point of regime evolution. So it's not that we have democracy as, something, and everything that happened, means that this is our, goals and models, and everything else is backsliding, moving back from an ideal. No, reality of things is that, there's varieties of democracy, variety of authoritarianism, and, countries move back and forth, there's a lot of degrees in between that, so that, I hope it's enough for you. Thanks.
Thank you. Second question?
2 points maybe to respond to your suggestion. The first one is, the view I've presented about constitutional patriotism, I think it was very influential at one point in the European integration process, but it's definitely a minority view nowadays. So when you say we are always looking in a negative light into the European history, not really. I would say right now, the dominant view is a view that says that we should celebrate our past and Europe as a civilization. Like the von der Leyen Commission had a VP whose portfolio, whose DG was called like protecting the European way of life. So it's really obvious that at this stage, the idea that there is a European legacy that is worth celebrating is the dominant view. But I would hold firm on the idea that I just think it is a methodological mistake to think that history is something that should be celebrated. I think history is something that should be studied, which is distinct. And when you say, for instance, that we had the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, I would fully agree, but I would say it is important also to study those eras, to know that, for instance, Renaissance is a very dark shadow as well. And so it is not that I want to paint everything in black. It's just that I want everything to be approached with the necessary nuances. And I think if we consider that European history needs to be celebrated, we need to lose track of that. And I think defending those values that I've presented, democracy, rule of law, human rights, require us to have a critical relationship to our past, not a celebration of our past. That's my point.
Hi,
Hi, I'm Banu. We're political science students from the University of Amsterdam, and we're here with Platform INS. My question is actually quite short. We have recently been actually actively been talking about that with our classmates as well. And when you mentioned it as well about how Europe has become more diverse now, and there's already a couple generations that now identify as European with a background from another country, and that's not from the EU. And my question was about how do states take responsibility for example, the consequences of colonialism, or because I feel like it has been kind of passed over in a sense, like, because for example, when we talk about the European major crimes like the Holocaust that happened there, it was taken into responsibility and it's always been remembered. But I feel like with colonialism after in the post-colonial time, it has kind of been like, okay, we're gone now, like, it's okay, rather than taking actual, like, accountability or continuous accountability in that sense.
Thank you. I'd say two things. First,
oh, sorry, can I really add as well?
Yeah.
Because now that a lot of time has passed, like you talked about, like Germany, like the youth doesn't identify with that anymore. I think like states do need to take accountability, but the citizens maybe don't feel like they have to, or like they don't feel that responsibility in that sense. So like, how would they now, in contemporary times, like take that responsibility or integrate that, I guess?
But two things. Like the first one is, I would say so if you take the German example, what is interesting is that the memory of the Nazi past was not something that sprung up in 1945. It took a lot of effort. It took a decade. For a decade, no one talked really about the Nazi past. It was like swept under the carpet and not discussed very much. And you had to wait for the 50s for that conversation to sprung up again, because some within the younger generation were holding their parents accountable or asking questions, and then it kick-started a conversation about this. And it's been a struggle. It wasn't straightforward. It was a political struggle, but that eventually bore fruits. And I would say it is true that the mindset of the younger generations in Germany is slowly evolving, but there is still a very vivid memory of the Nazi era, for instance, in the crimes of the past. Look at, for instance, the way Germany, and no judgment here, it's just like stating the obvious, but the way the different German political parties positions themselves in the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. So it's fairly obvious that this memory is still very lively. And that's the first point. So it is a work in progress. It is something that it needs to be sustained. The second point is, and I'll take a Belgian example, this is what I know best, but we had a legislative commission on the history of our colonial past. And the task of that legislative commission was twofold. It was to assess a bit whether what Belgium had done in Congo was reprehensible or not, and second, to answer whether or not we should present some form of excuses. And the result of that legislative commission is that we would not present excuse because we thought that, that was the conclusion of the commission, the parliamentary commission, that if we were to present excuse, then we would be liable to pay reparations, and we didn't want to do that, so there were no excuses. And second, that the different reports that were written in the context of this commission would not be made public, because they thought that what was in there was too incendiary, and they didn't want to share it with the public. And so I think it shows that obviously there are some blocks to this, And as I was hinting at the end of my presentation, I think it is very obvious in the way we conduct right now, or migration diplomacy, for instance, with some neighboring countries in Europe, and that we are, I think, ignoring some elements of the past in the way we conduct ourselves in those different countries. And so I think we need to start at home. We need to start asking questions about our past, and we need to be more open and upfront about it if we want to have a chance for the European diplomacy to evolve a bit. So yeah, that was my point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we don't have any time left. We have to go into a break now. But I encourage you, if our speakers will stay with us for the coffee breaks, to, if it's okay, to approach them and ask your questions. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to our amazing speakers. I truly was amazed by your insights, and I hope we can do it another time, and I would hope that we will have a big audience, because these things need to be discussed a lot, not just before the elections, but always, because democracy is an everyday exercise indeed. So thank you again, and I hope to see you again for another panel. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, great. So nice to provide a different form. Yeah. Oh, good to see you, girl. How are you? Oh, calm down. Meet you. Yeah. Hi, this is Camilla. Nice to meet you. Welcome here in Brussels. This is Camilla, the famous Camilla. This is Camilla. Yeah, but showing you pictures, I was like, How was she?